We finally got some good news. No matter how you twist it, no matter how you put it, the fact that the first major vaccine test in this country showed promising results is a great thing. And, relatively speaking, it's only 45 people. There's still a massive 30,000 people trial left to go. And that's all, of course, a fair way to put a sort of to keep everybody's reality in check. But no matter how you spin that, that's a good thing. And we just need some good news, something that's indisputably good news. It seems like everything that could be good news is indisputable in some way, but a vaccine showing promising results is indisputably good news. So we start the show with undisputably good news when we can start it with that kind of news. But it's the Jmull Show. Thank you so much for joining us on a Wednesday, whether you're at twitch.tv/the Jmull Show or on our website at 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thank you so much for making us a part of your day. 110 Sports on Twitter, at the Jmull _ on Twitter. If you haven't followed me or 110 Sports on Twitter, please do so. We're also on Facebook, and we push all of our content there on our social media pages as well. Subscribe to our newsletter on our website, so you'll get every Friday an email in your inbox with all the content from the week. If you don't want to miss any content, that's one of the best ways to do it. But thank you so much for joining us. Got a lot to get to. We're going to get to a lot of NBA, some golf. Every time I get a chance to talk about golf, we're going to talk about golf, and it's my show, and I don't care what you think about it. So we'll talk about that at 11:20, and then we'll talk impact players in the bottom part of the Western Conference playoff picture at around 11:40. If you weren't here on Monday, we started with the 5 teams that are outside of the playoff picture looking in the Western Conference, impact players on each team. So, we're trying not to talk about Damian Lillard for the Trailblazers, trying to pick an impact player because, of course, it doesn't matter what anybody on the Trailblazers does if Damian Lillard doesn't play well. So we'll continue that at 11:40 and then get to FYs. We got some good FYs, some cool news today. News that's literally years in advance, but some cool news coming out of the soccer world this morning, and we'll get to that to wrap up the show. But I want to start, and nothing huge has happened in the NBA since we last spoke, but just a lot of little interesting things that I think shed light on some things, and then just an interesting conversation about a player that, whether he plays or not, is going to completely change the scope of the middle of the pack in the Eastern Conference and where teams could possibly shake up. But we'll get to that in a minute. But what I wanted to start with is, so Russell Westbrook tests positive for COVID-19, and it comes out that that's why he didn't travel with Houston to Orlando. But James Harden didn't travel with the team either. James Harden arrives in Orlando yesterday. There's still no word about why. The Houston Rockets don't disclose why. It's certainly fair to connect the dots. Okay, Russell Westbrook tests positive. He doesn't travel with the team. James Harden also didn't travel with the team. Did he not travel with the team because he has COVID-19? He tested positive. He was waiting for his negative tests, so on and so forth. And hopefully, first and foremost, and I think this is, and even me, this is a place that we fail as sports fans, and me as a sports media member, to, when someone contracts COVID-19, when somebody tests positive, my instinct is to think, okay, how is this going to impact the Rockets, or how is Jokic testing positive going to impact the Nuggets, so on and so forth. And we're going to get to that here in a couple minutes, and some of the things I have to say about that. So I'm not faulting anybody, and I'm certainly not putting anybody on a pedestal as being a horrible person for doing that, because I certainly have done that as well. But first and foremost, let's just hope that Westbrook's symptoms are minor, that he doesn't have to go through too much pain and discomfort over as he's recovering. Hopefully he can get his negative tests and join the Rockets. I think that's sort of left in in the background behind the strategy and the conversation that could come around the impact it has on the NBA season, rather than just the impact it has on the person as a person. Because as we saw it with Freddie Freeman of the Braves, who was clearly, at least publicly, one of the professional athletes who has struggled the most with it and was hit by symptoms pretty hard. So I think we just, because of the level of health that these athletes are at and the level of physical peak and, the 1% of physical genes that these players are at, we just sort of assume that it's going to be okay. And for the most part, that's probably the case. But first and foremost, we hope that everyone who gets it is okay. And it's certainly not a foregone conclusion that it's going to be okay necessarily, even though it usually is. But with that being said, it certainly is an interesting conversation about what a guy like Russell Westbrook having to return from having the coronavirus might do to the way that he plays, what James Harden's conditioning might be like, if that is indeed why he ended up not coming to the bubble with the rest of the Rockets. Of course, the Rockets, like I said, haven't actually disclosed why, and I don't think they ever will. But it's certainly up in the air that could have been why he was late to Orlando and didn't arrive with the team when they did, 5 or 6 days ago at this point. But for a player like Westbrook, this is, we don't exactly know what the long-term effects of having coronavirus is. I mean, Rudy Gobert said recently to a French newspaper a French media outlet, that he tested positive months ago now, and there are still times when he's struggling with his sense of smell, which is part of, one of the side effects and one of the symptoms that can come from COVID-19. So it's been months. And I was listening to a different podcast, and one of the hosts said, he had a friend who, of course, not a professional athlete, but works in physical labor, and was really struggling to get back to work. Like, even after he tested negative, he tried to return to work and just didn't have the energy to do it, and was still struggling, weeks after testing negative, with his energy and his strength. And so it really takes a lot out of the body to fight this, of course, which, is not a mind-blowing thing to say. But for a player like Westbrook, who is all energy, go, 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 his athleticism is what makes him elite, first and foremost, combining that with his energy and his motor, having to deal with conditioning and just not having your body at the physical peak that it would be for an NBA season, it can completely change the way Westbrook plays, even if it's from instead of being able to do it for 33 minutes a game or however many minutes Russell Westbrook was playing this season. I'll look here just for fun to make a comparison. But even if it's, Russell Westbrook can only go hard for 24 minutes instead of 33, 35, 36, then I think that matters, and I think that has a significant impact on the Rockets. And on the James Harden side of things, James Harden is notorious for putting a lot of energy into the regular season, and as a result, he burns out in the playoffs quite a bit. But what this is different is we've essentially had an off season since the last time the Rockets played a game, since the NBA was postponed. So in theory, you have a James Harden who's been in off-season mode and getting his energy and just recovering from a season, and now he's going to have to play a max of 36 games, and James Harden's fitness over an 82 game schedule really isn't of question. It's the 100 games that he might play if he gets deep into the playoffs. That's the question. So 36 games, Harden can play like he does in the regular season and still be good to go for the playoffs, unless he's contracted coronavirus. He hasn't told anybody or hasn't disclosed it to the public, and then you're sort of in a similar position that he would be in a regular season after playing all 82 games. Russell Westbrook, 35 minutes a game, James Harden, 36 minutes a game. So even if it's, they can only go hard for 29 minutes, like that's a significant decrease in the amount of time that they could play. And of course, this is all speculation on the James Harden side of things, because if he did test positive, they're not telling why. And even though you get reports on if players have tested positive, there is an X amount of players who have tested positive. It's up to the players to disclose it whether they want to or not. I mean, we still don't know. A couple months ago, 3 or 4 Lakers players tested positive for coronavirus. We still don't know who those players were, and from a percentage perspective, there's a 30% chance that one of those players was LeBron, and that's not an insignificant percentage. The point being is that we're, as fans, as media members, at the mercy, so to speak, of what information NBA players want to be public, whether that's they certainly for good reason don't have to disclose if they're sick if they don't want to. I think for the most part we'll know when players test positive, but it'll just be the NBA has reported that now 4 more players tested positive, taking the total number to X, rather than 4 players, LeBron, James Harden, Russell Westbrook, and Paul George, have tested positive for coronavirus. Now, of course, once we get into the bubble, if a player's not playing, it's not hard to connect the dots, especially if it's a player who was fine in, the game 2 days ago, didn't get hurt, and then he's just not there, and there's a report that there's been a couple positive tests. It's not hard to connect those dots, but it's all, at that point, speculation, even if it's a pretty obvious connection to be made. But it'll be, hopefully it doesn't completely change the way that Westbrook plays, but it's certainly, there's a possibility that even if, his symptoms are minor or he's asymptomatic, that your body's still trying to fight this off, and he might see a decrease in, maybe it's a decrease in weight a little bit and a decrease in energy, and then you've got a different Russell Westbrook, which is, there's that conversation that how is a playoffs viewed differently if a team like the Rockets doesn't have their 2 best players at full strength? Or a team like the Denver Nuggets, who, Nikola Jokic loses a bunch of weight, also has coronavirus. Those two I don't think are directly related. I think he just got in better shape. But there's a learning period and a transition period when losing a bunch of weight, because you're going to lose some energy, at least immediately, just because there's not, whether it's because your eating habits are different or you're working out a lot or whatever it might be, there's a fundamental change in the way that your body works when you lose as much weight as Jokic did. And when you add the fact that his body battled COVID-19 for a little while, how does that impact Jokic and the Nuggets? But we'll see. We'll see if Harden, if he comes and he's slow and sluggish, then it'll just add to the narrative that maybe he tested positive. But I don't think we'll ever know. In my personal opinion, I don't think we'll ever know what actually happened, why he came 5 days later than the rest of the Houston Rockets did. But there's certainly dots that can be connected, and you might be able to see it on the floor if he's noticeably half a step slower, if he's noticeably fatigued quicker than he would be otherwise. But it'd be interesting. The other thing that I want to touch on in the NBA is Victor Oladipo and this weird course of events that have happened with Oladipo in the last couple weeks. So, of course, has a very rare and substantial injury to his knee. It's been quite a bit of time ago now, almost 2 years at this point. To be basically to that point when we get, basically later in this year. And so he's out for the rest of that season, out for a substantial amount of time this season, and then comes back sort of at the beginning of this calendar year sort of late in January, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, January 29th or something like that. And, talks about him being 80%. It takes him a little time to get back. At that point, I was, working at a radio station in Indianapolis, and all we were talking about for that, the next month was how does Victor Oladipo coming back change the way that the Pacers play, a team who had, quite frankly, played well without him and had a bunch of guys who had really fit nicely into roles that were only made available because Victor Oladipo was hurt. You bring Oladipo back, and of course, he reclaims his spot on the team without any question. But how does that change the dynamic of the team? And he, it took him a little while to come back, and then actually the last game that he played prior to the season being suspended was one of his best games. And you would think, even if he wasn't quite back to 100%, then if he's good enough to play, then you bring him back. Then you give him 4 months essentially to rehab even more, and then you should have a completely healthy Victor Oladipo to start the resumption of the NBA season. It didn't exactly go like that, because here we are on July 15th, and 2 weeks ago on July 3rd, almost 2 weeks ago, Oladipo announced that he wasn't going to return this season, but then he flew with the team to Orlando. And here's a couple things to recognize. One, every NBA team only gets a 35-member traveling party. So if Oladipo's not going to play, why is he a part of that traveling party? And the other thing to remember is that Oladipo employs his own physical therapist and rehab team. He spent most of his rehab in Orlando, where he lives, rather than in Indianapolis with the Pacers team doctors, because he does a lot. He outsources a lot of that medical, the medical help and the rehab help and the physical therapy help. So him going to, like, for example, Jeremy Lamb will go to, it makes more sense for Jeremy Lamb, who gets a lot of his rehab and a lot of his physical therapy from team doctors, rather than Oladipo, who doesn't get it from team doctors. So if he's not going to play and he's not using those doctors primarily for physical therapy or anything, why is he a part of that 35 player travel party? So we get here to Orlando, and he's playing 5-on-5 in practice with the Pacers, and then you're getting Shams tweeting out, reporting that, from The Athletic, reporting that there's growing belief that Oladipo will play at the beginning of the season, when the season actually resumes, and we're basically 2 weeks from tomorrow from that actually happening. It's a completely fair thing to think, right? If Oladipo's going to travel with the team and then going to play 5-on-5, I mean, he's not doing anything yet that the players who are 100% playing aren't doing. There doesn't seem to be a difference between Oladipo's existence in the bubble so far and the players that are healthy and have said that they're going to play's existence in the bubble. And this is, it's a little weird to, and Oladipo's never been a great communicator with either with local media or national media, and this is another instance where he's sort of, you're asking him where's the motivation? Why do you change your mind so quickly? What's the point of coming out as early as July 3rd to say that kind of thing if you're only going to go essentially a week later to the first practice in Orlando and play 5-on-5? It's an interesting, just from an Oladipo perspective, is interesting. And then when you add in the fact that the Pacers are very much a competitive team, fifth in the Eastern Conference right now, 39-26, and tied with the 76ers in the 5-6 spot, and only 2 games back of the Heat for 4th. This completely, if Oladipo plays and is healthy, that completely changes the scope of the Eastern Conference, at least in the middle of the pack, because without Oladipo, you think the 76ers absolutely have the edge to get that 5 seed, and the 76ers certainly have a chance to track down the Heat, who are only 2 games ahead of them. But now you've got a Pacers team that with Oladipo is certainly someone that can't be glossed over, especially when the Sixers and Pacers will play each other in the bubble. Whether Oladipo plays or not is massive for the implications of the Eastern Conference, and at least how easy it is for the 76ers to cement that 5 seed to maybe get up to a 4 seed. And, the 4 or 5 seed doesn't really matter. I mean, the Sixers are going to be either the 4, 5, or 6. So there's not really a difference between 4 and 5, because either way, there's no home court advantage, and you're either going to play the Bucks or you're going to play the Bucks in the second round. But that 6 seed, I mean, you get to play Boston more than likely, and then you don't have to play the Bucks until the Eastern Conference Finals, which matters, and that changes the complexion of what's happening in the middle of the Eastern Conference if Oladipo comes back or if he actually doesn't end up playing. But we'll see. It's if nothing else, a weird week and a half for the Pacers organization, thinking that their best player isn't going to play. Oh, maybe he is going to play. What's he doing in Orlando if he's not going to play? What's he doing playing 5-on-5 if he's not going to play? Because if the motivation is to make sure you're completely healthy, then just go to rehab, stay out of the bubble, and stop playing 5-on-5. Wanting to make sure you're 100% healthy doesn't seem to be the motivation when looking at what Oladipo has done since July 3rd, when he announced that he was not going to play in the NBA's return. But coming up next, we're going to talk about Tiger Woods returning to the Memorial this weekend in Dublin, Ohio, and I want to look at what he did last year and compare that to what he might do this year with the rest of the season, not playing very many tournaments, and what the rest of Tiger's schedule might look like. That's coming up next. You're watching The Jmull Show on 110sportsmedia.com. Welcome back to the Jmull Show on a Wednesday. Thank you so much for making us a part of your day. Whether you're watching on 110sportsmedia.com or at twitch.tv/the Jmull Show, very much appreciate it. Listen, it's very appropriate. I've got on the other side of the camera here, got one of those putting mats that has a little contraption that shoots the ball back to you after it goes through the hole. Just drained 4 putts in a row. I'm feeling good. I might say. The stroke looking really nice right now. Which is my really awful and just forced. It's true, there actually is a putting green right on the other side of the camera, but a horrible and forced transition into the next topic that I want to talk about, and that's Tiger Woods returning to the PGA Tour tomorrow at the Memorial, Muirfield Village, Dublin, Ohio. Jack's tournament. And really one of those tournaments, it's one of the few non-majors that is a staple on Tiger's schedule nowadays. He's getting up there in age. He's got a back that's literally fused together. And so that's just a little bit, we're not going to push that too much. So he's, of course, taking it easy. He's going to play for the first time on the PGA Tour since the Genesis Invitational at Riviera on February 16th. Only played 4 events in the wraparound season. Actually won one of those at the Zozo in Japan at the end of last year. But there's a question to be asked about what he'll do after the Memorial, because like I said, Tiger doesn't really do anything anymore except working his schedule around the majors, and to a certain extent every player does that. But Tiger doesn't exactly have to worry about trying to get into those tournaments anymore. I mean, he's going to be able to play in those tournaments. Of course, he's still up there in the official world golf ranking, so he's getting into a lot of tournaments just based on that, but also that he's won pretty much everything. I mean, right now he was once as high as top 10. I'm sure he's dropped back. Yeah, he's 14th right now, so he's going to get into every tournament that he wants to get into. But we saw last year, especially with the WGC FedEx Invitational in Memphis, is that a World Golf Championship isn't in and of itself isn't going to get Tiger out of bed to come and play in a tournament, and especially when the WGC FedEx is typically and historically has been situated right before the U.S. Open, and Tiger has never been a guy who is, I'm absolutely playing before a major to get my game tuned up, and it's been even less of a, it's not a choice that he makes nowadays, because the last thing he wants to do is tweak something right before a major and not have to play. So last year after the Memorial, he played 4 more times, and the Memorial for those, to give you an idea of when the Memorial usually is, it was the early in June. And so he played 4 more times after that. He played the U.S. Open and the Open Championship, because last year was the first year that the PGA Championship was moved to one of the first majors of the year rather than the last major of the year. So he played the U.S. Open, the Open Championship, the BMW, and the Northern Trust. The BMW and the Northern Trust being FedEx Cup playoff events, and I believe, unless I'm remembering incorrectly, that he didn't qualify for Eastlake, which is the Tour Championship, last season due to not being high enough in the FedEx Cup points rankings. But so you take that into account. After the Memorial this year, he'll probably play the PGA. So the PGA, like I said, it's in a normal year would be at the beginning of the year, between the Masters and the U.S. Open. But because it was being canceled, it's now August 6th through 9th at TPC Harding Park in San Francisco. So he'll probably play there. I'm guessing that once again he'll skip the WGC FedEx in Memphis, which is the week prior. That would end on the 2nd, so just 3 days prior to. And it doesn't seem likely to me that he'll come and play in Memphis and then have to get on a plane and change time zones, pretty significantly and fly across the country to go play in the PGA Championship in San Francisco 4 days later. Around Memphis, there's a lot of desire for him to play in that tournament because, you play in that he plays in that tournament, and it's immediately going to be, not this year, but anytime Tiger comes to your tournament, especially when he doesn't usually, it immediately becomes the most well-attended tournament in the history of that event. Of course, that won't be the case this year, but there's just a pull for the St. Jude Classic, invitational now because it being a WGC event. There's a pull of just being able to say Tiger's going to be there, so at the very least watch it on TV, and especially around here, being from Memphis, people get really excited about the idea of him coming to play. The fact that Rory McIlroy actually came to the FedEx Invitational last year was a big deal because he hadn't in quite a while, because it was a really popular tournament around here, but certainly not a really popular tournament in the grand scheme of things on the PGA Tour schedule. It was right before the US Open, and Rory's not one of those guys who loves to play right before a major either. So we'll see. I think there's whether or not Tiger's an interesting case study just because it was so long since he was actually healthy, and now he's back healthy, but he's, in some ways I think he's just a ticking time bomb until he sustains an injury that is just something he can't come back from. And the way to prolong that ticking time bomb, so to speak, is to not play as much as possible. And of course he has the luxury to do that. I think it's one of those things, though, that it might keep him from tracking down Jack's record of 18 majors, because the best way to win majors is to be really sharp, and not even Tiger Woods will be as sharp as he possibly can be when he's only playing the majors. I mean, for example, last year he played the Masters and then didn't play again until the PGA on the 19th of May. So that was a month later. He got cut. 72-73, that's 2 rounds over par, plus 5 got cut. He played solid, 2 weeks later at the Memorial, finishing in a tie for 9th. Didn't play for another 2 weeks at the US Open, and then didn't play for another month at the Open, where he shot 78 and 80. Got cut. Then shot 75 in the Northern Trust a month later, and then the week later at the BMW had three rounds in the 70s. Was actually under par every round except one. But the point being, it's going to be really hard for him to track down Jack if he's not playing enough tournaments to be as sharp as he could possibly be. Because then you get into a situation where you've got guys like Bryson DeChambeau, Colin Morikawa, guys that are playing week in and week out. Victor Hovland, like even these guys who you would never in a major without any context pick to win. I mean, maybe right now you would. I mean, I would pick Colin and Bryson over Tiger if a major started tomorrow, and probably will when the major starts in August, to be honest with you, if both of them continue their form that their current form, which is just a pretty ludicrous form, to be honest with you. But even Tiger being the greatest golfer of all time, with the level of play week in and week out, and guys playing every week leading up to a tournament, just because either they're trying to, make themselves as comfortable as possible. I mean, Tiger could spend $1 million every day for 2 years and still be able to spend $1 million every day for 2 more years and 2 more years after that. So he's certainly not somebody who's hurting for money and hurting for starts and hurting for just trying to, make sure you're as comfortable as possible like some of these other guys are. And most, golf is a ludicrous in terms of the purse nowadays. But we'll see. Before we break real quick and then talk about the impact players. The other interesting part of this is that the Workday Charity Open this past weekend was at Muirfield Village, and now you're going to have the Memorial, and that's just a byproduct of the changing schedule, once the PGA Tour was postponed for COVID-19. But it's the same golf course. And PGA Tour players beat up a golf course in a way that, like, an average weekend golfer doesn't. Like, every divot is perfect, so there are millions of divots in the fairways. The greens take a beating because every ball on the green makes some sort of divot. You got the spikes on the green. Those kind of things take a toll on a course over 4 days. But just how different is the Memorial going to play? Because the Memorial is clearly the bigger brother of the Workday Charity Open, but it's the same golf course. So will the greens be noticeably faster? Will the rough be noticeably higher? I read something that they think they're going to be able to grow it half an inch over, between Sunday and Thursday, which is, pretty substantial. I mean, the golf ball is, an inch and a half thick, something around there. So adding that half inch of rough is certainly not unimpressive or unimportant. But, Morikawa and Justin Thomas got into a playoff at 19 under at the Workday Charity. Will it be anywhere close to that good this weekend at a golf course that you would think is going to play a little tougher, considering it's the Memorial and one of the more important non-majors and one of the best non-major fields of the year? But we'll see. Coming up next, we're going to talk impact players for the 4 teams at the bottom of the Western Conference playoff picture right now. So that's the Grizzlies, the Mavericks, the Rockets, and the Oklahoma City Thunder. But we'll do that next. You're watching the Jmull Show on 110sportsmedia.com. Welcome back to the Jmull Show on a Wednesday. Thank you so much for making us a part of your day at 110sportsmedia.com/live. If you're on the site right now, take a peek at what we've got on the site right now. Our countdown of the 100 greatest college basketball players of the decade, 10 through 1 on the site today, being promoted today. If you haven't checked all of it out, there's a category on the website where you can look at all of them. And then I'm not going to spoil it here. You'll have to go and check out the article to see who number 1 is. But I was pretty happy with who ended up number 1, who number 1 ended up being on our list and the formula that we put together. But like I said, thank you so much for joining us on a Wednesday. Halfway through the week, we're getting there. What I want to talk about now, and if you weren't here on Monday, we chatted about impact players for the 5 teams in the Western Conference, looking on the outside, looking in at the playoff picture. Guys like, it was Carmelo for the Trailblazers, looking at some of the young players for the Suns that could sort of play a role in the continuation of that franchise. They've got some really nice young pieces. I talked about Brandon Ingram on the Pelicans, not Zion Williamson, because Brandon Ingram playing really well. Take some of that pressure off Zion. So we're going to continue that today. We're sticking in the Western Conference. I think we'll just go through the Western Conference. Maybe on Friday we'll go to the bottom 5 teams in the East, sort of, the Wizards, and then those 4 teams at the bottom of the playoff picture in the East. And then go with the best 4 teams in each conference next week. But so those 4 teams we'll talk about today, the Grizzlies, the Mavericks, the Rockets, and the Oklahoma City Thunder. I want to start with the Grizzlies. And, for me, I think this one is pretty clear, of course, Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr., the young sort of foundation of this team. Ja Morant quickly becoming a superstar in the NBA. He's probably going to win Rookie of the Year. He should win Rookie of the Year. But of course, that's yet to be seen. But I think the player who is going to be really important for the Grizzlies here in the restart is Justice Winslow. Winslow, who came to Memphis in the trade that ultimately sent Andre Iguodala over to the Heat. Iguodala was technically a Grizzly for the majority of this season, and was just sort of asked to not be a part of the team. So first of all, shouts to the Grizzlies for getting somebody, in a trade, basically getting a player like Winslow who fills a hole that I thought the Grizzlies had in their roster, while also offloading somebody like Iguodala, where the Grizzlies had no leverage because everyone knew the Grizzlies were trying to get rid of him, and everyone knew that Iguodala didn't want to be there. And that's the type of thing that there's not a whole lot of leverage in a trade. So getting Winslow was first and foremost another win for the new front office of the Memphis Grizzlies. But, if Winslow stays healthy, he can be the guy who guards the best perimeter player on the other team. I think, you'll never be, when Ja Morant is really focused on defense, you're never going to be at a disadvantage necessarily with Ja, with how quick he is and athletic he is. He's certainly not going to get blown by basically anybody in the NBA. So you never feel bad when it comes to Ja on the defensive end. But now you've got a guy in Winslow who you can feel pretty good about guarding the best player on the other team. 6'6", 222. He's a big dude and can guard a lot of the sort of the elite perimeter players in the Western Conference. He's sort of that replacement for Jay Crowder. Jay Crowder was part of that trade at the deadline as well. He's kind of a younger version of Crowder. He's a little bit better scorer than Crowder, averaging, I think it was 10-ish points a game this season before being out for some time with an injury. But hopefully he can fill that role, slide into the starting lineup. You've got a lot of offensively talented players, but Jaren Jackson Jr. is still struggling with foul trouble. Ja, of course, his offensive abilities are really his trademark. Dillon Brooks becoming one of the more confident offensive players young offensive players in the NBA, and certainly has become an offensive threat that I thought he wouldn't be in the NBA. And of course, it's Valanciunas, and what they were kind of missing was that piece in the middle of their starting lineup, like Winslow, who really can set the tone defensively and guard the best player on the perimeter for the other team. Because I think Valanciunas and Jaren Jackson can handle, for the most part, whoever's down low, and Ja Morant's never gonna, at least gonna be able to give trouble to pretty much anybody, any guard in the Western Conference on the defensive end. But Winslow sort of fills that hole. So Winslow's the guy for the Grizzlies that needs to make a big impact when the bubble returns. For the Mavericks, you can really pick any guy here that takes pressure off of Kristaps and Luka Doncic. But I went with Seth Curry. He spaces the floor. He knocks down a bunch of shots. He scored at least 15 points in 11 of the 13 games he played prior to the All-Star break. Tim Hardaway Jr. is a solid three-point shooter in that starting lineup, but there's certainly nobody who shoots the ball anywhere near as well on this Mavericks team as Seth does. 45% shooting from the three-point line this year. He tweaked an ankle a couple of days before, I think roughly a week before the NBA season was suspended, but he should be fine now. It wasn't a serious injury and should be at 100% 4 months later. So anybody who's taking the pressure off of Luka and Kristaps is going to be an impact player. A player like Seth, who is capable of knocking down a lot of shots and capable of being a formidable offensive threat, and especially one who can space the floor and give Luka and Kristaps a little bit more room to operate if he's just pulling players out to the three-point line, keeping them in the corner, because you have to respect his ability to shoot the ball. And he's the type of guy that can knock down a couple shots, 3-4 shots in 2 minutes and completely change the nature of a playoff game. which is also a helpful kind of guy to have on your team. In Houston, it's Robert Covington. A really solid three-point shooter and a perimeter defender that immediately ups the defensive abilities of a team that, especially at the guard position and at the perimeter position, they aren't exactly known for the tone they set defensively. I mean, you got Russ, who, of course, we've talked about him and his energy and motor means he's not a liability on the defensive end, but, James Harden is never known for his defense, and Eric Gordon, you can say the same. So they've got a lot of scoring, and Robert Covington can certainly be an asset on offense when he's knocking down shots, but he's, quickly turned himself, he's built up a reputation as one of the best perimeter defenders in the NBA, and that instantly ups the defensive ability of the Rockets, especially a Rockets team that has some good interior presence on the defensive end and good rebounding happening there. But when you have a guy like Covington who could set the tone on the perimeter, sort of like Justice Winslow, but I think Covington's just a different level of player so far than Winslow is. He's certainly, I think, a very important player for the Rockets. And then finally, OKC. I'm going to go with Danilo Gallinari. OKC quietly has one of the best backcourt duos in the NBA this season. CP3 and SGA, they're averaging together 37 points, over 10 assists, over 10 rebounds, and roughly 3 steals a game. I mean, SGA is going to be an elite point guard in the NBA for a long time. There will be a point, I'm pretty confident, that he's one of the 7, 8, 5 to 7 best point guards in the NBA. He's elite and one of the reasons that the Clippers sold their soul basically to OKC to get Paul George. But one of the biggest assets that they got in that trade was SGA, and the Clippers really liked SGA for good reason, and he's been just as spectacular in OKC since being traded. However, neither of them shoot the ball incredibly well. I think they're both solid three-point shooters. I think they're both around like the mid, like 36-ish percent, 37-ish, somewhere around there. Gallinari is easily the best three-point shooter on this OKC team, and his ability to knock down shots in Orlando could be the difference between OKC winning a first-round matchup, which is their current first-round matchup would be against the Jazz, and advance to the second round. So he could certainly have a big impact on a playoff series, especially for a team like Oklahoma City that right now doesn't have an arsenal of three-point shooters. I mean, based on percentage, he's at 40%, and next being Dennis Schroeder, who's coming off the bench and who's been a really solid backup to SGA and Chris Paul, but certainly is not an elite three-point shooter, and of course he's coming off the bench. And then after, Gallinari shooting 41% and then Schroeder 38%. Nobody else is above 37.1%. Chris Paul's at 36.2%. SGA 35.1%. So Gallinari, for the floor spacing that can come in OKC, he's certainly a really big part of that. But we'll continue to do this over the next 3 or 4 shows. That's the Western Conference bottom half of the playoff picture right now. Winslow for the Grizzlies, Seth Curry in Dallas, Robert Covington in Houston, especially with some of the news coming out of Houston in the last couple of days, and then Gallinari for the Oklahoma City Thunder. But coming up next, we'll wrap up the show here on a Wednesday with some FYI. You're watching the Jmull Show on 110sportsmedia.com. Welcome back to the Jmull Show on a Wednesday, wrapping up the show with some FY. Thanks so much for joining us today. 110sportsmedia.com. We got a lot of good stuff over there. Chris Brown, Around the Bases, just started his preview series for the restart in Major League Baseball. The top 10 in our college basketball players of the decade list just released today. So if you haven't checked those things out, go over to 110sportsmedia.com and do so. We'd very much appreciate that. But want to get to some FYIs before we get out of here today. We got some good ones. The first one, the World Cup in 2022, set to begin on November 21st, with the final being on December 18th. I kind of love the idea of World Cup soccer during the holidays. I actually really like that. Can you imagine? I mean, it's probably not a great thing for football. I mean, of course, Thanksgiving in 2020. Let's pray that in Thanksgiving 2022 we're back to normal. Man, I guess that's the first one. Let's just root really hard for that. But assuming that we are, you got football back, and that will always dominate Thanksgiving in this country. But the idea of there being soccer all of Thanksgiving week, you're hanging out on that Friday after Thanksgiving, that Saturday, having World Cup soccer at that during that time, and then you're really gearing up for Christmas by the time the final comes around. I kind of like that a lot. I'm actually a really big fan of that possibility. It just feels like that isn't something that, and because it's so freaking hot in Qatar, where the World Cup is going to be, it makes sense that it's happening when it is. But I'm a really big fan of that, and just it's one of those things that it doesn't come around nearly as often as I wish it would, because the World Cup, even for me, who is not what I would describe a major soccer fan, but certainly one who enjoys the game, it's one of my favorite sporting events every year that it comes around. So World Cup, November 21st, 2022. Put it on your calendars, and let's hope we're back to a point where we can all do nothing but enjoy that, rather than talk about the implications that a global pandemic has on that event. FYI number 2, Peacock, the NBC streaming service. I'm a huge Psych fan. Sean Spencer, Dule Hill as Gus. Huge fan. New Psych movie. This is very personal. I don't care. It's my FYI. I think you should know about it. A psychic detective who's actually just really observing, who just notices a bunch of stuff. He got great observational skills, and it's hilarious. And then some personal news. I'm now a Columbus Crew soccer fan. Let's go. I needed a team. And we had Josh Doring on the show late last week, and to talk about MLS. So I went to him. I said, "Listen, I need a team that has promise, but that I'm never going to get a lot of flack for being a fan for, and that will probably not be the favorite." So I needed the Denver Nuggets, and he gave me the Denver Nuggets in form of Columbus Crew. They play tomorrow night against the New York Red Bulls, 4-0 in their first game against FC Cincinnati, who's bad, but they got the Red Bulls tomorrow night. I'm pumped to continue the beginning stages of my Columbus Crew fandom. But that's all the FYIs today, and that's it for the show. Thanks so much for joining us on a Wednesday. Like I said, 110sportsmedia.com. Check out all of the content that's over there. Follow me on Twitter at the Jmull. You see it right under the camera here. And follow 110 Sports on Twitter at 110 Sports. But stay safe between now and Friday, and we'll meet back here, twitch.tv/ The Jmull Show or 110sportsmedia.com/live. We'll meet back here, same time, 11 a.m. Eastern on Friday.